how Polish American immigrants helped gain independence for Poland in World War One by Ismail Hussein and Franz Hatta. What if I told you a fraction or a small unit of people brought forth the independence of a country? Hard to believe, right? How could a small unit do this? Well, today I'll tell you how Polish American immigrants helped brought Poland's independence in World War One. Now, before we talk about how this happened, we have to look at the history of Poland. We have to look at the context of it. So, as some people may know, before World War One, Poland was ruled by three imperial superpowers: the Prussians, or what we know as Germany today, Russia, and the Habsburg monarchy all ruled Poland before World War One. According to the Library of Congress, quote, at the turn of the 20th century, Polish immigration exploded. Imperial repression, land shortages, and chronic unemployment made life more and more untenable for the Poles of Europe. And as for the 19th century waned, they all left for America by the thousands, then by the hundreds of thousands. Quote, life was very harsh to the Poles due to these problems under the empires. Life would slowly but undoubtedly get harder and harder with more challenges due to the improper rule of these empires. This was also on top of the fact that the Poles were actively oppressed due to them wanting their own state, while also being discriminated against for their identity and religion. According to the Library of Congress again, quote, the Polish people's own fight for independence was less successful and their national identity came under harsh attack. By the 19th century, the ancient state of Poland had been conquered and divided up by three imperial powers: the Russian, Prussian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. Although they were separated by distance and political barriers, Poles were unified by a belief in their own independence, in their freedom to worship as Roman Catholics, and in their distinct identity as a people. The difficulty of maintaining this identity under hostile imperial regimes led many Poles to seek freedom overseas. Quote, the idea of Polish people wanting their own state was harshly attacked by ruling empires. The Polish people were also oppressed and did not have freedom due to the fact that they were Catholics and not Protestant or Orthodox like the rest of Europe. This led to many Poles immigrating to overseas due to the unbearable conditions and the fact that there was a chance for a much better life overseas. Now, as to America, what did the Polish people do when they came to America? According to the University at Buffalo, quote, over 2 million Poles came to the United States, flocking to cities like New York, Detroit, and Chicago for industrial jobs. They embraced democracy and the American way of life, but few forgot how Europe's empires exploited their motherland. As World War I continued to escalate into 1917, it became clear Poland had a chance to become independent. Pianist and future statesman Ignacy Paderewski led recruitment efforts across the U.S., urging immigrants to flee their country. Thousands of Polish Americans volunteered to fight in the Polish unit called the Blue Army, named so because of their light blue uniforms. They would prove to be formidable against their enemies. Quote, you can see from here that the Poles went and got jobs here in America, mainly industrial jobs. They moved to places such as Detroit and New York for work. But even as the Poles kept moving for work, they always kept their homeland in mind and heart. Eventually, they would be able to fight for that homeland. One of the many places the Poles moved to was a place in Michigan called Hamtramck. So many Poles moved there to the point that they made up 83% of the population in the town, giving them the name Little Poland. Another group of Poles who adapted to the American lifestyle was the Polish Society in Grand Rapids. According to them, quote, hoping that one day their homeland would be reunited and they could return home, many Poles desired to keep their national and religious traditions, customs alive among themselves and their children. Each church had its own school where English and Polish were taught, quote, and quote, even though they settled here in America and had comfortable or desirable lives in America, they still wanted to return to their homeland and maintain their identity. Now, let's talk about how much the Polish army did in Poland. Well, the Polish army, they did a lot. According to James S. Paula in his work of Our Sacred Duty, Poland's diaspora fights for Polish independence, 1894 to 1921. He says, quote, "The Blue Army brought to Poland some 1,240 officers and about 68,000 men, virtually all of them trained veterans. They also brought with them all of their arms and some very important heavy weapons. These included 18 British-built Bristol F-2 reconnaissance airplanes and Italian-made Ansaldos A-1 Balillas that provided excellent reconnaissance capabilities, as well as the ability to bomb and machine gun enemies' formations and emplacements. They also brought 123 French-made Renault FT-17 tanks that came in two forms, 75 armed with 37mm cannons and 48 with 8mm machine guns. The acquisition of these vehicles gave the Poles what was then the fourth largest armored force in the world. Quote, from what James S. Paula says, the Poles had brought heavy machinery and artillery to fight against the Germans in Poland. And what was the result of that? Well, according to Podligia, a government website, they say, quote, after the overthrow of the Tsardom, units consisting of only of Poles, 3 corps, were created within the Russian army. Their members tried to distance themselves from the chaos that was growing in Russia. And after the October Revolution tried to maintain neutrality in the war between the White and Red armies as a result of the ongoing political changes in Russia, her Western allies, namely the United Kingdom, France, and Italy, began to see Poles as desirable allies. In the summer of 1970, France began forming the Polish army, named the Blue Army after the color of their uniforms. Soon, volunteers from Western Europe, the United States, and Canada, as well as Polish POWs from the German army, joined its rank. The Blue Army began its fight against Germany in the last days of the war. The last Polish divisions fighting along the Central Powers were dissolved in a speech. Addressing Congress in January 1918, Woodrow Wilson announced the reconstruction of an independent Poland with access to the sea, stating it as one of the conditions for permanent peace. Quote, as a result of the Blue Army going into Poland, they ended up making the Germans and Russians surrender and gained Poland's freedom as a new country with conditions which made it seem like they would have a permanent peace. What was the aftermath of the war? Well, according to Nipod Legla, again, quote, when the war in the West ended in October or November and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart, the Poles began to disarm the occupiers and to create institutions of an independent state. Freed from his German captivity, Joseph Pilsudski took over full civil and military authority from the Regency Council as chief of state upon his arrival in Warsaw on November 11, 1918. A new episode in Polish history had just begun. Quote, Joseph Pilsudski, the one who was in charge of the Blue Army previously, had taken over Poland, and he was in charge now. Under his authorities, the Poles got rid of the oppressive empires which oppressed the Poles for so long. The Poles are finally free from these empires. They are free to be Catholic, and they are free to be Polish. Now, that's all I have to say, and so as my conclusion of this video, I'd like to end off by stating again that Poland's independence couldn't have been achieved without the effort from the Polish-American immigrants who in America used their love and support of their homeland and sheer force to get rid of the oppressors within their home country and free it from these oppressive empires which they had been under control for so long.